All right, welcome to today's lesson in Spanish translation. Today we're going to talk about definitions and models, answer the questions, what is translation, and what are some of the steps in the process of translation. So first of all, some basic terms which we may have already covered in class, right? When we talk about translation, we talk about going from the source text, or ST, to the target text, or TT, in the source language, SL, to the target language, TL. So those are basic terms. And in Spanish, source text is texto original, or texto de partida, or texto fuente, literally. Or source language could be lengua or idioma original, idioma de origen, idioma o lengua de partida, or idioma fuente. On the other hand, right, target text is going to be texto meta or texto objetivo, texto de destino, or texto término. So those are all, as well as idioma meta, lengua meta, objetiva, etc. Okay, so those are some basic terms that you'll want to be sure that you know in English y en español. Moving on, let's look at some definitions. These come from the discipline of translation studies. Some of these people are dedicated translation scholars, some of them might be linguists, but let's look at these definitions. What is translation? A person named Catford, in his book, A Linguistic Theory of Translation, back in the 1960s, defined translation as, quote, an operation performed on languages, a process of substituting a text in one language for a text in another. Translation may be defined as the replacement of textual material in one language, the source language, by equivalent material in another language, the target language. So what he's talking about replacing is textual material in one language for textual material in another language. That's kind of vague. What is textual material? Let's look at Peter Newmark, one of my favorite translation theorists. His definition is translation is a craft. So it's interesting that he calls it a craft, consisting in the attempt to replace a written message and or statement in one language. So whereas Catford had talked about textual material, Newmark is more specific, a written message and or statement in one language by the same message and or statement in another language. So some important things to unpack in Newmark's definition. First, he calls it a craft. So it's an ability, it's an art, it's a skill that we develop. We're replacing a written message or statement, going from one language to another. And I like how he says it's the attempt. So it's something that's difficult to do, and also the same message. So he hits on that idea of equivalence or correspondence. All right, moving on to one of my favorite theorists in translation studies, Mildred Larson. I like this definition. She talks about the form and the content, right? So she says, quote, translation is basically a change in form. It consists of transferring the meaning of the source language into the receptor language or target language. This is done by going from the form of the first language, so the source language, to the forms of a second language by way of semantic structure. So she says, and this is important, it's meaning which is being transferred. So the meaning is held constant, only the form changes. So she says translation then consists of studying the lexicon, grammatical structure, communication situation, and cultural context. So all those things we need to analyze, right, when we look at a source text, analyzing in order to determine its meaning, and then restructuring the same meaning using the lexicon, grammatical structure, cultural norms, etc., that are appropriate in the receptor language and its cultural context. So she's making a distinction between form and meaning, or form and content, and saying what must remain the same is the meaning or the content, but what must change is the form. We'll come back to her definition when we look at her model in just a minute. A similar definition is by Susan Bassnett-McGuire. She says, what is generally understood as translation involves the rendering of a source language text into the target language so as to ensure the surface meaning of the two will be approximately similar and the structures of the source language will be preserved as closely as possible. Now, if you go back to the previous slide, Larson was talking about changing the form but holding the meaning constant. Bassnett-McGuire is talking more about a give and take, right? We want the meaning to be as close as possible, but we also want the structures or the forms, the language forms, to be as close as possible. But not so closely, she says, finishing up here with her quote, that the target language structures will be seriously distorted. She's basically saying that we want the language of the source text to look as similar as possible to the language forms in the we want the language in the target text to look as similar as possible, but not so similar that they distort the target language structures, right? That they seem unnatural to a target language reader. Let's look at some models. Going back to Mildred Larson, who talked about meaning is what's transferred, but form is what changes when it's restructured. So some of these models are similar, and I think Mildred Larson's model is the one that makes sense to me, and the others may be variations on this idea. She has the source language, right? This orange box. That's the text that the client gives the translator to be translated. The translator's task is to discover the meaning. That's actually harder than it might appear. And then what's held constant is that meaning. The translator's job is to reformulate, restructure, re-express the meaning in the receptor language in forms that are appropriate for the target language. So again, with Larson, meaning is held constant. We sort of deconstruct the source text, figure out what it means, and then we reconstruct that same meaning using the appropriate target language forms. Another model by Eugene Nida here, similar, right? He's showing how that determination of meaning involves analysis and then transfer and restructuring into the target language. So a similar sort of sequence and process. Newmark, if you look, also the same steps. You start with the source language text, you go to interpreting or comprehending, understanding what that text is saying, and then through a process of reformulation into the target language text. That dashed or dotted line he has across the bottom that says interlinear translation. Interlinear translation is word-for-word translation, which he's trying to illustrate that that's not real translation, because word-for-word translation skips the steps of true comprehension and true reformulation. All right, so kind of putting all those things together, I've come up with my own definition, right, based on several that I've read. And so this is the one I want you to remember. My definition and model of translation is what this course is kind of based upon. So I would say that translation is a multi-step process in which various elements pertinent to the overall meaning of a text in one language, its content, its purpose, the language register, how formal is it, tone, effect on the reader, among others, cultural issues, are replicated as closely as possible in another language. So that's what translation is. And it's important to understand, if you see the blue box, and I'll always reiterate this point, that translation is a process that involves continuous decision making. And so in terms of a model, or the steps in this process, I've identified 5. The first step is to not immediately start translating the text, but to read it and interpret it, right? We need to determine the meaning of the source text, and only the translator can do that. So what does the source text mean? First step is to read it and interpret it, determine its meaning. Second step is to perform an analysis, to analyze the source text, right? Assess the contributions of several contextual and textual factors to its overall meaning. So we're trying to answer the question in the analysis phase or step, how does that source text convey its meaning? Third is strategizing. This is when we decide, okay, what are we trying to do with this translation? What types of equivalency are we going to prioritize? And which translation approach, a more literal approach, a more free approach or freer approach, or some other type of translation approach? So we're thinking about how we're going to achieve that effective translation. That's strategizing. Finally, step 4 is when you actually dig in and start transferring the meaning, restructuring the text, reformulating it. I call this step reformulation. So that's when you're actually translating the source text, creating the target text through the application of various translation procedures. But then you're not done. You still have step 5, which is review. That's when you're proofreading the text, editing the text, making sure it's accurate and free of any errors or mistakes. Okay, so that's my 5-step model: interpretation, analysis, strategizing, reformulation, and review. Let's look at one more slide. I think this is just kind of interesting to think about as we begin this course. What makes a good translator? For example, an agency translator, a freelance translator, or just an amateur hobbyist translator who's good and effective. This is the skill set that looking at several different websites and speaking to professionals that I know and through my own experience that I've identified. First of all, if you think about that first step in my model, translator has to have strong interpretive skills in the source language. Usually the source language, the SL, is the translator's second language. So, as a non-native speaker of Spanish, usually Spanish is going to be the source language. I'm usually going to translate from Spanish to English in a professional setting. So I need to develop super good interpretive skills in Spanish. Second, and this is very, very important, translators have to be excellent writers. If you're not a very good writer in English, you're probably not going to be a very effective translator. Okay? So you need to develop really good writing skills, particularly in the target language, which is usually the translator's native language. So again, in my case, look at me. Do I look like a native Spanish speaker? My language pair is going to be Spanish to English. That's going to be my directionality. You need to develop a deep understanding of the cultures of both source and target languages. Cultural understanding, cultural sensitivity is very important to be an effective translator. You need strong computer skills, not just word processing, typing in Microsoft Word, but also spreadsheets, PowerPoint. You get all types of source texts in different formats. You need to be familiar with the resources and tools, computer-assisted translation tools that translators use. So just overall excellent computer skills. You need very strong research skills. You need to be a good critical thinker. You need to be able to find accurate, reliable information quickly. So if there's something you don't understand in the source text, you need to figure it out quickly. Thank God for Google and resources like that. You also, especially if you're working as a freelancer, you need very good interpersonal communication skills. You're going to answer a lot of emails, you're going to send a lot of emails, you're going to take a lot of phone calls, and so you need to be an effective interpersonal communicator. And if you're working as a freelancer or on your own, you've started your own company, excellent time and workload management skills, because translators basically make their money based on volume. So it's all about being efficient, being able to translate as much as possible, as much as you can, as quickly as possible. And finally, some traits, not necessarily skills, but personal or personality traits that make people effective translators. Detail-oriented, being self-motivated, because often you're working on your own. You're not working with a team. Being organized, intellectually curious. If you're not a person that likes to learn, gets excited about different ideas, new fields, you probably won't stay in the translation game very long. Need to be culturally sensitive, as I just mentioned, decisive, because we talked about translation being a process of decision making, and confident, but not overconfident, because I think something that translators need to develop is that awareness of knowing what they don't know, so that they can look those things up. So again, this was today's video, covered definitions of translation, models of translation, my own definition and model as your instructor, and then finally we looked at the translator skill set. Hope this has been informative, and I'll see you in class.